Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. In the previous lecture, we studied the society of the 1950s, and the main points I was trying to make was that it's a rather conservative decade, also a prosperous one, but also quite materialistic or complacent and conformist. And so you have quite a few young people who feel unhappy with the way things are going, or rather not going anywhere because it's a very conservative time, and they want reforms, and specifically reforms to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. Because one sociologist had mentioned how there is another America out there that is extremely poor. Well, today we're going to look at the 1960s and what some presidents did to address those concerns, and that would be two Democratic presidents, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Let's start with JFK. So elected in 1960, took office January of 61, and famously got shot in November of 63. So he actually has a very, very short kind of career. And still, you'll see him mentioned in documentaries, he appears in movies, and there's an aura around him and his wife. And you might ask why? I mean, it is a fairly short-lived president. And in his lifetime, he also was not as popular as he would be today. He was elected in a very, very tight election. The 1960 election pitted him against a Republican candidate, and that would be the outgoing Vice President, Richard Milhous Nixon. And this election is kind of famous because it's the first one that kind of featured TV as being playing an important role. Specifically, there's a presidential debate between the two of them that is either broadcast on the radio for people who don't have a TV set yet, or on the TV. And it's interesting because when the people who listened to the debate were polled, those who listened to it on the radio tended to think that Nixon had won because he had spoken better, whereas those who had listened to it on the TV thought that Kennedy had won. The big difference being that they could look at Kennedy was a good-looking man, projecting an air of confidence and youth, whereas Nixon kind of looked like a crook. Well, he was a crook. And also he had that 5 o'clock shadow, he could not shave very well, and that's a big difference. That now we get into the era where appearance is very important because we are away from the era of the radio and the newspapers, and we are now in the TV era. But even with the victory in the debates, the Kennedy election in 60 was extremely close. In fact, he won because he won Texas and Illinois. In both of his states, there were allegations of fraud, so it could really have gone one way or the other. And so he lived for a very short time as president, and he was elected by a narrow margin. What is special about him? Well, for one thing, he's young, he looks young, and that appealed to all these young baby boomers, because before that you have grandpa as president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and now you have a man who looks much more like you. We now know that Kennedy was actually very sick. He had back problems and a variety of other health problems, but back then he looked like he was a young, good-looking man, and so did his wife, who is also sophisticated, cosmopolitan. She was of French descent. Her real name was Jacqueline Bouvier, and so that really appealed to that young generation of the 60s. Many of the people in his cabinet were also young and good-looking, such as the brother, who was Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and so people compared his cabinet to King Arthur and Camelot. Also helping to the fascination with the Kennedy era would be the allegations of extramarital affairs, specifically the one with Marilyn Monroe, and then the circumstances in which he died tragically in his prime due to an assassin's bullet in Dallas in 63. So what has he achieved? Well, he did achieve some things while he was president. Let's look at the domestic achievements. One thing that he did do was to create the Peace Corps, and that's aimed at people just about your age who go to college and then don't want to go straight into the workforce because they want to have some exciting adventures as a young person and do good. They're young, maybe naive, but very idealistic young people that want to change the world for good. So in that case, you would go to a poor country like, say, Guatemala and help set up a well or teach in a school and so forth. And the idea was to combat the Cold War in a different way. Instead of sending missiles and troops and subverting foreign governments, why don't you improve the image of the United States overseas by sending all these young, idealistic people, and that way people will want to be on the side of the US rather than a Cold War, purely because the American capitalist system is more appealing. That program still exists today, and so that's one of the big legacies of the Kennedy era. He's also the one that made that pledge to go to the moon, and he always had a beautiful way of speaking, and that's part of his appeal. So he didn't just say, let's go to the moon. He said, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And he said hard with the Boston accent, which as a French American I can't quite do right. Obviously, he died long before people actually went to the moon, but he gets the credit for it because he started the challenge. One more topic on the moon, this is 2019, so it would be the 50th anniversary of when Americans first walked on the moon. And if you go to the dark corners of the internet, you'll see plenty of conspiracy theories that somehow we never went to the moon, and by the way, the Earth is flat, and by the way, Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill Kennedy. I don't know how to answer to all the crazy people out there. I'm a historian, I deal with evidence and facts, and the facts tell me that Kennedy was not killed by some giant conspiracy, and that Neil Armstrong did set foot on the moon, one of the great achievements of that era. But the fact that people are willing to believe all that nonsense starting in that era does tell us something about the changing national mood. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s, people have a lot of trust in their government. People admire Franklin D. Roosevelt because he saved them during the Great Depression. And then they admire all the GIs who fought and won 2 wars against Germany and Japan during World War II. But 2 things changed during the 1960s. The first is the Vietnam War, which is really launched under false pretexts, then a lot of things are not told to the American public, and eventually by the early 1970s you have a situation where Nixon launches kind of a side war into nearby Cambodia and Laos. Not only does he get no approval from Congress for that, but he does it without even telling the American public. So you have secret wars by then, and when people realize the extent of the lying surrounding the Vietnam War, they lost a lot of their faith in government. At the same time, in the 1970s, you have the outbreak of the Watergate scandal, which we'll study in a later lecture, but really uncovered the fact that Richard Nixon had lied a lot to the American public. So by the 1970s, you have a more jaded public that is less willing to embrace whatever the government is telling them, and that might be the reason why, indirectly, people start to embrace crazy conspiracy theories. That, in a way, is one of the sad legacies of the 60s and 70s. We have lost our innocence. Some of Kennedy's most admirable kind of achievements were on the foreign policy area, and from the get-go he was a strong anti-communist. You can read his inaugural speech, which is another very powerful, very well-written kind of speech, and in it he made famously a pledge to pay any price and bear any burden to make sure that the torch of freedom would pass on to a new generation, meaning that he would do whatever it takes to stop the communists. One of the hotspots, as always, was Berlin, which, as you remember, had been divided at the Yalta Conference, where the western part was in American, French, and British hands, even though it was isolated between a larger sphere where the Russians would be occupying. And in 1961, that got into a big crisis because many people living in Eastern Europe under communist rule who were unhappy with living under communist rule decided to flock to West Berlin as the one point of entry into Western Europe. And that became kind of embarrassment to people in communist Russia who thought our system is better and somehow our people are trying to escape through West Berlin to the rest of Europe. So to prevent that from happening, that's when they built the famous Berlin Wall around West Berlin, and that's one of the crises that Kennedy had to deal with. There were some fears in 1961 that this might turn into an actual nuclear war between the 2 countries, so Kennedy was able to cool things down in large part by saying, well, the wall is not an aggression against us, it's just to prevent their people from fleeing. It is not built on the territory of West Berlin, and so let's just let it stand. It doesn't violate the policy of containment. In fact, it would be a great propaganda asset for the US going forward because it looks very bad for the communists if they have to build a wall to prevent their people from fleeing. And that wall stood up until November of '89 when it was destroyed by the people of East Germany, and that's what eventually brought an end to the Cold War. Kennedy went to Berlin in order to tell the people of West Berlin, we will stand by your side. So when he spoke well, so he said it used to be back in the days of ancient Rome that people were proud to say, I am a citizen of Rome. And today, in the days of the Cold War, people are proud to say, I am a citizen of Berlin. And trying to be cosmopolitan, he said it in German, Ich bin ein Berliner, as though he got his German confused a bit. Apparently a Berliner is a local type of pastry. But people understood what he meant, and they were very happy that the president was on their side. The other big crisis that they had to deal with was that in Cuba in '62, and I'm going to upload a whole video which covers the history of Cuba under Fidel Castro. Here's just a short version of it, that this was an obsession of the Kennedy administration. He tried on multiple occasions to overthrow Castro, including to some silly attempts by the CIA to kill Castro, and that was called Operation Mongoose, all of which failed, or to arm Cuban exiles and land them in Cuba, and that was a Bay of Pigs operation, and that one failed as well. And Castro and the communists were so concerned that the Canadian administration might invade Cuba that Russia sent thousands of troops to Cuba, including nuclear missiles, and that's what started the nuclear missile crisis of 1962, which again was solved with great skill by Kennedy, who managed to negotiate behind the scenes with the Russians to have a deal whereby America would withdraw its missiles from Turkey, an American ally, in exchange for which Russia would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, and that averted nuclear war. And in the whole history of the Cold War, that's the one moment where the two countries came closer to nuclear Armageddon. So after the death of Kennedy, the person that would become president, according to the Constitution, is his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who came from Texas. And his personality is quite different. Here you have a very cosmopolitan young man from Massachusetts who looked good and so forth. And here you have a person, Lyndon Johnson, who came from Texas, had a strong Texan accent, older, not quite as physically attractive, and a person who had not come from money the way Kennedy had. Kennedy was a very rich person. His dad had been U.S. ambassador to Britain during World War II, whereas Johnson had a much hard-scrabble life in the middle part of Texas, in the hill country. He had done very well for himself. He's a true rags-to-riches story. He actually became quite rich on his own. But he always had that chip on his shoulder that he felt that people did not respect him the way they would respect old money like Kennedy. The way he became president was not quite traditional. I mean, he became president because Kennedy was shot in a way that people still could not wrap their head around. So many people thought there must have been some funny business going on with the Canadian death, which happened, of all places, in Texas, the home state of the president, of the new president, Lyndon Johnson. And there were some ugly rumors flying around that the main beneficiary of that assassination was, well, the vice president who had become president. Again, there is no evidence whatsoever that Johnson actually played a role in killing Kennedy, but that's the rumor that's flowing around, and that helped make Johnson quite insecure. And there's a lot of aspects of his life that is based on insecurity. And if you're interested in learning more about his life, I would recommend the book by DORIS, KEARNS, GOODWIN, called Lyndon Johnson, The American Dream. It's by a great, great presidential historian, and she had an opportunity as a young woman to interview Johnson in many, many ways. So the book is not just about the politics. And there's something weird sometimes about the psyche of Johnson because he is so insecure. I'll give you just a couple anecdotes. He would have a habit of going skinny dipping in the White House pool while his aides were around. And apparently not because he was an exhibitionist, just it was a way of making people around him a bit insecure. Or he would go to the bathroom and carry on the conversation with the door open while his aides were not quite sure what to do because the president is there going number one or number two in front of them. Again, that's like a cheap trick to try to make people insecure. There's another anecdote where he went to the hospital for some minor surgery, and when he recovered, he invited all the journalists in his hospital room and was very proud to pull up his gown from the hospital and then show them the scar, as if he were some 10-year-old kid that was very proud of his scar. And all the journalists could not help but snicker and say, well, if Kennedy had been in the same situation, he would not have done something as unbecoming. Thank God the president had not gone through surgery for hemorrhoids. So the point that I'm trying to get is that Johnson had a lot to prove. He doesn't really deserve to be president in the eyes of many, and he is in the shadow of Kennedy. So that led him to try to outdo every president, starting with Kennedy, but even other famous Democratic presidents. In that case, the big shadow is that of FDR, and to do even more than everybody else. And he was able to do that for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the previous president, Kennedy, had been shot. There's an outpouring of grief in the country, and many Americans are willing to do everything that Johnson is asking them to do because he said that's what Kennedy and his program, something that was called the New Frontier, that's what Kennedy had in mind. And we're just doing that as a tribute to a dead man, which was a cheap trick, but it worked. Many people passed the laws just because that's what Kennedy would have wanted to do. Also, Johnson knew something about passing laws because he had been for a long time in politics, specifically in the Senate. And so he knew every senator by name, and he knew the legislative process. If you're interested in his career in the Senate, Robert Caro, who is a prominent historian, has written a series of biographies of Johnson, which is kind of a massive, definitive look at it. And there's one volume on his career in the Senate called The Master of the Senate. I'm taping this in 2019. Robert Caro still hasn't finished the last volumes and is getting old, and some of his viewers are getting very worried that he might not finish the last volume of the Johnson biography before his passing. So stay tuned for that. But in the case of Johnson, because he knew the Senate so well, he was able to get laws passed, including things on civil rights, for example, that would be voted by white senators from the South, would be very much against civil rights, but he knew how to manipulate people. That became known as the Johnson treatment, and the photo that you see here on the illustration is a good example of that. Notice that Johnson is talking to that senator, and he's about, 2 inches from his face, and this is a big guy, so he's a towering figure, quite impressive, and he's telling that senator, well, vote for that law, and I know you don't like it too much, but if you vote in my favor, then I'll make sure that there's a U.S. Army base that is built in your district, or maybe there's a big NASA program in your state. So it's kind of the carrot approach. If, on the other hand, you cross me, then I will destroy you and I'll crush you like a bug. That's the stick approach. And by doing so, he was able to convince a lot of wavering senators to pass his law. So all the thing that really helped Johnson is that in '64, he got to run as president on his own name. And that year turned out to be a great year for Democrats, because on the Republican side, the Republicans nominated a very conservative figure called Barry Goldwater, who came from Arizona. And when I say very conservative, the idea that Barry Goldwater had back in '64 would be very mainstream in the Republican Party today, because the current Republican Party has shifted very far to the right. But as of '64, the Republican Party was far more moderate in the wake of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he seemed like a fish out of water. Normally in an election, you try to go to the center to appeal to undecided voters, and because Barry Goldwater was so far to the right, he lost a lot of that middle. He appealed to the hardcore Republicans and not too many other people. So with Johnson being a popular president, Goldwater being too far to the right, that was a good election for him. Also, Johnson used ads on TV, because now you have campaign ads. It's the 1960s. People have TV sets. There's one ad that has become infamous. It's called the Little Girl in the Meadow ad. It starts with a little girl who is frolicking in the meadow, picking flowers, daisies, love me not, that kind of thing. Very cute scene. Except as she goes through the petals, some ominous voice is starting to do a countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7. And as you get to 3, 2, 1, then you hear the rumble of a rocket, and you cut to the image of a missile going off, and then a nuclear flash. And then that's kind of the message after that. If Goldwater is elected '64, here's a right-wing nut. He will start a nuclear war, and he will kill your little girl. And indeed, Goldwater was what was called back then a nuclear use theorist, a nut, a person who thought that you could wage a nuclear war and win it, a bit too enthusiastic about using nuclear weapons. And so Johnson used that in his head and generally in the campaign to portray Goldwater as the person that was too dangerous and might start a nuclear war. During the '64 election, the supporters of Barry Goldwater had a button that said, "In your heart, you know is right," to which his opponents replied, "In your guts, you know is nuts." Whatever the reason is, Johnson won a huge landslide in '64 and got huge majorities in the House and the Senate, and that also helps him pass laws, and that became known as the Great Society Program. Earlier in the class, we had covered the New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt, where for a period in 1933, Congress passes dozens of laws at a rapid pace. The only other period in U.S. history where you have so much going on so fast would be the period in '65, when Johnson passed the Great Society Program. The Great Society Program had two main purposes. The first one is to combat poverty, and the second one is to reduce inequality between blacks and whites. So the first half would be nicknamed the War on Poverty. And a lot of programs are passed during that time, which created a welfare state that in many ways we still are living with today. Medicare and Medicaid, and you're familiar with those programs, subsidized health care for the poor and the elderly. Well, that's a program passed in '65 and one of the big legacies of the Great Society. Program for the healthy development of poor kids, Head Start, that's also a legacy from that period. Also of note would be the Immigration Act that is passed during the '60s. And we've talked about immigration quite a bit in the class. We started in the late 19th century, where there's a surge of immigration in the US, and many Americans were concerned that many of these immigrants are coming not from the British Isles, but from other places in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, or East Asia, and there's an attempt to prevent non-whites from immigrating to the US, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's kind of codified in 1924, where there is the Immigration Act passed under the Republican presidencies at that time to set up quotas to prevent people that are not from, say, Great Britain from coming to the US, or at least come in small numbers through the quota system. And that's still a law that is in effect in the 1960s, a law that is quite discriminatory. You're just saying, I want that particular race to come and not people from, say, Asia, Eastern Europe, or Africa, or Latin America. So Johnson changed it, and because he's all committed to racial equality, he created a system that we have today, where the quotas are set based not on your racial affiliation or the country you come from, but based on need. So currently, if you want to come to the US as an immigrant, there are different ways. You might come on an F1 visa, and that means you come as a student temporarily to study and then go home. Or if you have a very specific skill, like you're a computer programmer from India, for example, you might get an H-1B visa, which also is temporary. So in some cases, you can obtain a green card and stay more permanently. Or let's say you marry a US citizen, and then you could get a green card for that because, well, couples have to be together, or you can ask family members to come along, again, as a way to keep families together. And you also have a green card lottery that allows a number of people to come per year, and it's a lottery, so people from all over the world can be a part of it. So you notice there's no place in there that says we want people from that country or that country. We want black people, not white people, or whatever race that you prefer to have. It's a colorblind process. And that's still the immigration system that we have today, and I'm talking about legal immigration here. Illegal immigration is something else altogether. So things might change in the future. The current president called during the campaign in 2016 to have a ban on Muslim immigration, and he actually has instituted part of that, and the Supreme Court decided to go along with it. So now you would have an immigration system that is based more on which religion you have, apparently. And in another speech, the president called for an end to immigration from what he called, and I quote, shithole countries, unquote. And that means countries in Africa mostly. That's what he had in mind. So kind of preventing people from Muslim areas and black areas from immigrating to the US. If that becomes a permanent addition to the immigration system, that would be a big change from the system that had been set up by Johnson back in the 60s. So stay tuned for that. Johnson is also the one that created the Department of Transportation, Department of Housing, the Department of Education, all these big kind of programs that now are active in various areas of the country's economy, when the Constitution had said that the US government at the federal level should only deal with interstate commerce, which is quite limited. Johnson pushed that much, much further. In the case of the Education Act, the idea is to give subsidies to schools that are in poor districts and have a poor tax base to pay teachers with, so that you can have a better education even if you're a poor kid in a poor area. So there's some welfare developments in there, but a lot of it is about giving people a chance. That if you have good schools, a healthy start with Head Start, and access to good healthcare through Medicare, Medicaid, then you have all the skills needed to succeed in life. And then after that, well, you'll succeed on your own merit. And that's what Johnson had done since he came from poverty and had succeeded in his mind due to his educational skills. The second half of the Great Society would be desegregation, and I'll get back to it when we do a lecture on the Civil Rights Movement, but long story short, it's because of him that two very, very important acts are passed. One is called the Civil Rights Act, and that's the one that banned any kind of discrimination in public facilities, such as a restaurant cannot close off its lunch counter to black patrons, for example. That would also apply to the workspace, so an employer could not tell to a female employee that she cannot be promoted because she is a woman. And he also passed the Voting Rights Act, which tried to prevent all the shenanigans that used to be used in the South to prevent black people from voting. So that's the one that reinstituted the one man or one woman, one vote throughout the country. So a lot of achievements to his name: ending segregation in the South, combating poverty, creating huge programs like Medicare and Medicaid. And normally when you do so many domestic programs, you have to abandon your international ambitions because you can't have guns and butter, is the expression. Butter meaning things for domestic purposes, guns meaning fighting a war. Because domestic programs are quite expensive, war is very expensive, so you don't have the money to do both at once. Well, in the 60s, Johnson is also the one that amped up American involvement in the Vietnam War, and we'll have a lecture about that. And he thought you could do both, guns and butter. And to some extent, he could do it in the 60s because this was a prosperous time. He also raised taxes quite a bit and also started raising the deficit as well. But that did create problem by the late 60s in the sense that this would create rising deficits, high inflation, and eventually would be one of the causes that would lead eventually in the 1970s to the stagflation era. Also of note, the Vietnam War did not end too well. And there are some debates still as to the legacy of the Great Society because, well, it's kind of a liberal-conservative divide. Either you look at Medicare and Medicaid as a great program to help the poor and the elderly pay for the doctor, or as a conservative, you look at the same programs and you conclude that they are an abomination, that you have to raise taxes or run Rent Inc. To have a nanny state that will take care of people when they should be taking care of themselves. So that's one of the long-term legacies from that era. Well, that's all I have to say for today. Next time we'll still talk about the 1960s, but in that case more from a racial perspective. And we'll have two lectures, one that will talk about racial relations before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and then we'll move on to the Civil Rights Movement to try to get equality between blacks and whites. Au revoir and goodbye.